Hello and welcome to American History class. Today, our group will present about the Boston Massacre in 1770. Let's start with the background and causes of this story. Moving back to the year between 1756 to 1763, there was a 7 years war known as a French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was the war between the British and the French. Basically, both countries want to claim territory. But the point was, an Indian who was a translator for George Washington killed the French governor. Unfortunately, the governor was the brother of French commander. So, the French and the British began to fight.
The French have no such problems with their native allies. They arrive accompanied by 100 Shawnee, Mingo, and Delaware warriors.
About 9 o'clock on the 3rd of July, the enemy advanced with shouts and dismal Indian yells.
Washington intends to fight face-to-face in the field, European style. But the French and their Indian allies don't cooperate.
In the end, although the British gained the victory in this war, it was plunged into a great financial cost. The national debt increased nearly doubled from paying for the war. Consequently, the Parliament of Great Britain decided to enact new taxes on the colonies of British America to gain money. Boston was the capital of Massachusetts Bay Province, which was an important shipping port. Unfortunately, several acts were set, including the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Quartering Act, Declaration Act, and Townshend Act. These acts caused struggles and resentment of the colonists, led to numerous protests. To illustrate, in 1765, the Stamp Act was enacted and said that colonial printed materials must be produced in London and marked with a revenue stamp. The colonial paper goods, including newspaper, playing cards, legal documents, and anything they wish to print, which impact lots on the colonists. Not only that, this act allowed the British to censor what to publish. In other words, the British would not allow the colonists to print anything that went against them, because it could make more people realize how bad the British were. One important symbol from the protests against the Stamp Act was the Liberty Tree. It was a large elm tree that a crowd gathered under to protest. On the 14th of August, the protesters hanged a letter AO on the tree, which stands for Andrew Oliver, the colonist whom King George III chose to impose the Stamp Act. Eventually, the Tree of Liberty became a rally point for the protesters, like the Sons of Liberty, and the growing resistance to British rule over the colonies. Apparently, American colonists who had no representation in Parliament saw the act as an abuse of power. The colonists insist that they would not pay taxes without any representation in the British Parliament. The slogan of the protest was, "No taxation without representation." British sent troops to enforce the unpopular new laws in America, further escalating tension between Great Britain and American colonies.
Even though the colonists were already upset, the British government still continued to pass several acts on the colonies. For example, the Quartering Act, enacted on March 24, 1765, outlines the condition in which British soldiers must live and be fed in the American colonies. The Quartering Act was a source of contention between some colonies and the British Empire that lasts until the Revolution, despite not prompting the immediate and violent protests that the Stamp Act provoked. Because of the unrest, the British sent more troops to America. Rather than house British soldiers in their homes, American colonists opposed the Quartering Act of 1765 because they were taxed to pay for provisions and barracks for the army, which they believed that these were unnecessary during peacetime and aimed to be against them. Another significant example of acts was the Townshend Act between 1767 and 1768. The British Parliament passed the Townshend Act to tax goods including glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the American colonies. Now, let's talk about the incident of the Boston Massacre. On the morning of March 5th, someone spread a rumor of soldiers planning to cut down the Tree of Liberty. This provoked the colonists to be even more outrageous. Referring to the previous situation in Boston, the colonists disapproved acts that the Parliament set. Also, the British sending military troops to control people was unpleasant for all colonists. On a snowy evening that day, Private Hugh White was standing alone guarding the king's money stored in the Boston Custom House. Suddenly, a group of colonists came to threaten violence. Then, White fought the colonists back with a weapon. Bells that used to ring for the fire were unexpectedly used to call people to join in assaulting him on the street. With approximately 50 angry people, White had to call for reinforcement. Captain Thomas Preston later appeared in the chaotic scene with a few soldiers in order to support White and protect the king's money. The mob threw snowballs, stones, sticks toward the British soldier. Unfortunately, one soldier was hit by a stone and fell to the ground. So, the soldiers began to fire, killing 3 people on spot, including a black sailor named Crispus Attucks, a rope maker named Samuel Gray, and a mariner named James Caldwell. Furthermore, 8 people were wounded, and 2 of them, Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr, died after.
As a result of the Boston Massacre, 5 Bostonians died, 11 were injured, and a total of 13 people were arrested. Crispus Attucks is generally known as the first person to be killed in the Boston Massacre, and thus the first American killed in the American Revolution. Attucks was the only African American killed, and the first African American in history to stand up for freedom. After the incident, after the soldiers were acquitted, Samuel Adams denounced the shooting as a massacre. Later, this episode is often used by colonial leaders to inflame anti-British feelings. The Boston Massacre deteriorated relations between Britain and American colonists. The colonists continued to rebel after the Boston Massacre. The colonists, who already despised the British rule and the unfair taxation, therefore decided to fight for independence. Preston wrote about the conflict and said none of them was a hero. The victims were troublemakers who got more than they deserved. The soldiers were professionals who shouldn't have panicked. The whole thing shouldn't have happened. The soldiers said what transpired was not a willful act of murder. They said they were outnumbered, threatened, and assaulted for hours. However, the public opinion didn't care what the soldiers had to say. In the weeks following the massacre, the British loyalists and Boston radicals fought a propaganda war. The loyalists insisted the citizens were at fault for not following British laws, whereas the radicals believed that the massacre was an intentional, unprovoked attack designed to subdue the spirit of liberty. Clashes continued to occur between Boston citizens and British troops. And eventually, the British troops withdrew the entire 29th Regiment from Boston in order to maintain peace. On the day of the trial, Samuel Adams pled that the soldiers acted in solely self-defense and asked the jury to look beyond their prejudice and recognize that the soldiers' lives were endangered while surrounded by a hostile crowd. Adams' public opposition of the taxes meant no one would ever accuse him of being a loyalist. A prosecution witness claims he saw Preston give an order to fire while standing behind his men. However, Adams produced a testimony from a witness who had his hand on Preston's shoulder when the shooting began. That witness swore Preston never gave an order and was standing in front of his man. Two other witnesses swear the shout of "Fire!" never came from Preston. After the testimony, Adams addressed the jury saying, "I will enlarge no more evidence, but submit to you, gentlemen. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or our dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts, and the evidence, nor is the law less stable than the fact. If an assault was made to endanger their lives, the law is clear. They had the right to kill in their own self-defense." The jury then deliberates for 2.5 hours. At stake were the soldiers' lives, but also Adams' reputation. The jury delivers the final verdict, not guilty. 2 of the soldiers were convicted of manslaughter, not murder. The convicted soldiers were branded on their thumb with the letter M, and if they were to break the law again, the mark would ensure a harsher sentence. The American Revolution was still years away. However, the Boston Massacre had helped turn colonial sentiment against King George III, the government tax policy, and the British Army. In the wake of the trial, Adams' legal business took a major hit, but his involvement in the case and his newfound reputation for impartiality, along with his skills as an orator, made him an appealing voice in revolutionary circles. Adams became a delegate in the Colonial Congress and helped draft the Declaration of Independence. During the war, he served as a diplomat, helping to gain naval support from France and negotiating a peace treaty to Britain. In the 1780s, while minister to Great Britain, Adams ran into Captain Thomas Preston in the streets of London. These 2 men, passing on the streets of London, ignited the revolution.